Hey gamers, Chris here. This is Treantmonk's Temple, where knowledge is power. Today I'm going to be doing a viewer requested video. A viewer requested to me that I do a deep dive into the Magic Initiate feat. I told him I had done a video for feats already and I had talked about Magic Initiate, and then a second viewer said, yeah, but we would like you to go a little more in detail on this. So, okay, let's do that. Let's talk just about the Magic Initiate feat. Let's talk about some general strategies when we take that feat. Let's talk about what cantrips we might want to select. Let's talk about what first level spells we might want to select. And let's talk about, if we take that feat, which class we want to select as the class for which we are going to select spells from. So let's do that deep dive right after this. Until then, let's get started. So the first thing to remember about the Magic Initiate feat is, unlike Ritual Caster, this does not require any kind of ability score minimum. So that means we can select things like the Wizard spell list, even if we have an intelligence score of 8 or lower. But because of the lack of the requirement for a primary ability score, that severely limits what spells we want to select with this feat. Generally speaking, we want to avoid any spell that's going to require it to hit roll. We want to also avoid any spell that's going to require a saving throw. There's additional other spells that also rely on ability scores like Cure Wounds or Healing Word, and we probably want to avoid those spells as well. So let's talk a little bit about what spells we might not want to avoid. And we're going to do cantrips first, then we're going to talk about first level spells. I'm going to use my rating system that I've used in guides in the past, where blue means this is a really good option, green means this is a good option, purple means this is an okay option, and orange means this is going to be circumstantial. Now, I'd normally also have a red rating as well, but if a spell would be a red rating, let's not talk about it at all. Let's only talk about spells we might want to consider taking with this feat. So we're going to talk about cantrips first. I'm just going to go through them in alphabetical order for the cantrips I think are reasonable choices for this feat. And the first cantrip we're going to talk about is Booming Blade. Now there's two cantrips that are very similar here. There's Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, but Booming Blade is the better option for the Magic Initiate feat for a couple different reasons. The first off is Green Flame Blade will rely on the ability score depending on what class you take, either Charisma or Intelligence. Booming Blade will not require those at all. So this becomes the better cantrip to take if we're playing a class where that ability score is not our primary ability score. The second thing about Booming Blade I like is if we're doing something like the Warcaster feat and we're maybe doing Booming Blade as an opportunity attack. Opportunity attacks tend to be triggered by somebody moving out of our attack radius. So Booming Blade would not only do its primary damage, but also its secondary damage in those cases. Finally, this can be useful for maybe even characters that get multiple attacks around in a case where they're doing a readied action. Because if you're doing a readied action to take an attack action, and this isn't commonly known, you get one attack. So then you can do a readied action instead to do a Booming Blade, and you're still getting that one attack, but at least you're getting that additional damage on top of that. This is gained from the Warlock, Sorcerer, or Wizard spell lists only, so those are the choices if you're going for this spell. And the ones who should go for this spell, I think for rogues, this is a great choice. For melee clerics, this is also a great choice. For other classes that do melee attacks, I think this is a decent choice. I don't necessarily think it's your best choice in those cases. If you're not attacking in melee or you're primarily a spellcaster, this isn't for you at all. The second cantrip we're going to talk about is the Friends cantrip. The Friends cantrip gives you advantage on charisma checks against one creature. That creature doesn't get a saving throw, so it automatically works. This is actually a terrible spell to make friends with because that creature is going to become hostile to you when this spell ends, which is generally 1 minute time. So this becomes a very quick use of a cantrip for things like getting past a guard or intimidating someone, or maybe you want somebody to become hostile to you. So there's some specialized circumstances where this comes into play. This generally is something you want to use if you're the face of the party. If you're a character that's not using charisma checks very often, you're not going to use this spell very often. So this becomes circumstantial, and it's even circumstantial for those face style characters. So for those characters, I think Friends is a decent choice. For any other character, I wouldn't bother with this. This is available from the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, or Wizard spell list. And again, I would only take this in a case where I'm playing a character that's maybe charisma based. Maybe I'm playing something like a paladin. Then I could see something like the Friends cantrip coming into play. But it's not going to come up all the time. Don't use it to make friends. You're only going to use it in those circumstances where you need to make a charisma check against somebody, and then you're going to not be concerned about them becoming hostile to you a minute later. Then let's talk about the guidance cantrip. You guys know guidance is one of my favorite cantrips in the game, certainly in competition for my favorite cantrip in the game. Generally, if guidance is available on a spell list, I take it. It's going to give you a plus D4 on ability checks, or your allies plus D4 on ability checks. Uses your concentration. But the thing is ability checks come up all the time. It can be even things like initiative rolls. And as long as you know it's coming up, you can cast guidance, get that plus D4. It's going to come up over and over and over again, and you should use it all the time. If you're not concentrating on something else, then you want to be using guidance as often as you can, because that plus D4 is often the difference between failure and success. It's only available on the Cleric or Druid lists, and it's really kind of one of the reasons why you might consider those two when you're taking the Magic Initiate feat. That brings us to the Light Cantrip. The Light Cantrip is just solid. I mean, it's just a source of light. You can cast it as often as you need. It's 20 foot of bright, 20 more feet of dim light. You can use it on something like a rock, so you can cover it up very easily. You can also use it on a rock and then throw it down a hallway. And then there's light down the end of the hallway, maybe showing how far the hallway goes or what kind of creatures are at the end of it, and keeping yourself obscured in darkness. You can use it to drop down a well to see how far the well goes down, or a pit to see what's at the bottom of the pit. Over and over and over again, you're going to find uses for this spell. Generally, this is a spell I really want to grab if I'm playing a character that doesn't have dark vision, or I'm in a party where other characters don't have dark vision. But even in a party where everyone has dark vision, you're limited to 60 foot range, so that light spell gives you the ability to see past that range. So it's even useful in those circumstances. It's available from the Bard, Sorcerer, Cleric, or Wizard spell lists. The next cantrip I want to talk about is Mage Hand. Mage Hand is straight up telekinesis. It gives you a 30 foot range. Now I guess it shows like a ghostly hand that does the telekinesis, but telekinesis is useful in all kinds of situations. If you're maybe opening a chest, I'd always use Mage Hand, because there's going to be things like poison needles or gas traps, and you avoid those. Same thing if you're opening a door. Use your Mage Hand. Anything that's got a ready to action on the other side of the door to attack whoever opens it is going to be pretty disappointed. Also, again, if there's traps on the door, you can often avoid those traps. Finally, if you're in something like a prison or maybe locked in manacles, you can use it to get that key and unlock your prison cell or your manacles and get away. And there's other uses for telekinesis as well. You know what they are. They come up, and they're circumstantial and they're hard to list. But if you take Mage Hand, you're going to find uses for it. It's available on the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, or Wizard list, and no matter which of those I take, Mage Hand is probably something I'm going to consider. The next cantrip I'm going to talk about is Mending. Mending is a cantrip that mends a break in any item, including magic items, though it doesn't restore magic to an item that's already lost its magic. It only mends breaks that are less than a foot in diameter, but this comes up a lot. In fact, I find that if I take the Mending spell, I always use it. I can't possibly list the number of situations where Mending comes into play, but if you take it, you're going to find you use it over and over again, and if you don't take it, you're going to wish you had taken it over and over again. It's available on all the spell lists except for the Warlock list, and I really kind of recommend it for anybody. I also really like Mending for archers, because by the rules, we can only recover half the arrows we use. And if you play by the rules, those arrows do not last. No matter how many arrows you have, you're going to find you go through them like water. And then the Mending spell would allow you to recover those arrows. Now, I've had somebody tell me in a recent video that if you know anything about archery, then you lose an arrow, it shatters into a million pieces, and so Mending's not useful to you. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about archery. I certainly have never had an arrow shatter on me, but if you know about archery and you find that arrows shatter into a trillion pieces when you shoot them, then mending isn't going to work for that. This is really if an arrow splits in half or those kinds of things. I kind of think that makes sense to me, but again, I'm not an expert. I'm not going to claim to be an expert. Next cantrip I'm going to talk about is message. Now, message, the way it reads is you're going to whisper, and then that whisper travels to another party member, and then they hear it. But really, what message is it's telepathy. Because number one, it goes through walls, and number two, no one can hear the message except for you and the recipient. So that really is telepathy. And then they can send a telepathy message back to you. So this becomes useful in any party where you need secret communication. Now that's specialized. That doesn't mean that every party needs the message spell, but if you are in a party, particularly if you're doing a political campaign or you're a party that often uses deception, things like message can give you a way to communicate with other party members secretly. And obviously that's going to be useful in those situations. It's available from the Bard, Sorcerer, or Wizard spell list. And again, I would take this in a campaign where social situations come up where party needs to speak with each other secretly. The next cantrip I'm going to talk about is Minor Illusion. I've talked about Minor Illusion many times because I love Minor Illusion. I think it is either the best cantrip in the game or maybe in competition with Guidance for the best cantrip in the game. I can't possibly discuss all the uses of Minor Illusion, but just in general, it can either create an illusion that's 5 foot square or smaller, or it can create a sound. Those sounds can include things like voices. And obviously there's a million creative uses for this, but there's the tactical use as well. If you're in combat, you create a bush or a rock and then you can hide behind it. Or you can do it in front of another party member to hide them. Or you can do the sound of the approaching dragon that maybe will scare off your enemies. So a bunch of different uses for this tactically and infinite different uses for this non-tactically that come outside of combat that I can't possibly list here. This is available from the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, or Wizard list, and if I'm taking one of those classes with my Magic Initiate feat, Minor Illusion is pretty much always going to be my first cantrip selection. The next cantrip I'm going to talk about is Move Earth. Now I often get comments from people who love this spell, but it does depend. There's a bunch of different uses for Mold Earth, but the one that everyone talks about is the ability to excavate 5 foot square of dirt in one round with one action. So that's a huge amount of dirt. If you've ever dug a hole, being able to do 5 foot square in one action is amazing. And there's tactical uses because you're essentially creating a trench or a pit or a barrier all within one action, which is super useful. Unlike Minor Illusion, that's technically an illusion. Move Earth is going to create a physical barrier because you create a pile of dirt, of course, and never mind the trench. That, in addition to obscurement, there's actual cover you're creating with this spell. However, this spell is limited to excavating loose earth. Now, what qualifies as loose earth? I mean, things like dirt or sand, I would think, are almost for sure. But what if that dirt is packed? Is packed earth loose earth? Well, that kind of depends on your DM, doesn't it? And what if you're in a cavern? Well, then it's not useful. What if you're in a castle? Then it's not useful. If you're inside, it's not going to be useful. So there's lots of circumstances where this is obviously not going to be useful. And then there are additionally the circumstances where it's kind of DM dependent. And for those reasons, I am a little bit hesitant about the Move Earth spell. I think it's definitely a spell you want to talk about with your DM before you take it. What qualifies to your DM as loose earth? Because if they're really only talking about non-packed earth, that's going to be very limited. That means you're not going to be able to use it on roads, you're not going to be able to use it on trails, and suddenly this spell isn't going to be useful to you very often. It's available on the Druid, Sorcerer, or Wizard spell list, and in campaigns where this is going to be usable a lot, I think it's a good spell. That brings us to the Prestidigitation cantrip. This is a cantrip I talk about a lot as well. I don't think Prestidigitation is a powerful spell. This is largely kind of a role-playing spell. When I take Prestidigitation, it's usually to do things like make it seem like my character has magic at their beck and call, that they can use it casually. Things like the food doesn't taste good, so I use the spell to make it taste good, or it's cold, so I use it to warm it up, or my clothes got dirty, so I use it to clean the clothes, or we need to light a campfire, so I snap my fingers and the campfire lights. Those kinds of things. Prestidigitation is very much a cantrip that's going to create a feel to your character that they have magic at their command. And then you can use it over and over again. So tactically, as a power spell, not really useful. But for that character where you're trying to create that kind of feel for them, then this is a must. If I could have a cantrip available to me in real life, I would want this cantrip. It would change my life. It would change your life. And it will change your character's life in terms of role playing. In terms of combat, you're not going to see a lot of use for this. It's available from the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, or Wizard spell list. And again, I'm going to take this with a character if I want magic to be at their beck and call as kind of a character-driven thing. The next cantrip I'm going to talk about is Shillelagh. Now, Shillelagh is a bit of an exception to my rule of not taking a spell that's reliant on an ability score, because Shillelagh is very much reliant on your ability score of Wisdom. Shillelagh is a druid spell only, and what it does is, as a bonus action, you turn a club or a staff into a magical weapon that does d8 damage, but most importantly, it uses your Wisdom for an attack roll and for your damage. The reason I bring this up on this list is if I'm playing a cleric, and I'm playing a melee cleric, then Magic Initiate becomes a decent option specifically for the ability of being able to use my melee weapon using my Wisdom score. That's kind of a big deal because clerics have this issue where they need to take Wisdom, but they also often need their strength to use their melee weapon. But if you have Shillelagh, you don't need the strength anymore. Now you just can focus on your Wisdom, and it's kind of increasing everything. Now that bonus action that you use to cast Shillelagh can be pretty valuable and can compete with things like using Spiritual Weapon. But in general, if I'm playing a cleric who is going to be going into melee, I think Shillelagh is a strong choice if you take the Magic Initiate feat, something to consider. The final cantrip I'm going to talk about is Spare the Dying. Now I find even if I'm playing a cleric, I tend not to take Spare the Dying because in my experience of role-playing, we tend to be able to have access to some form of healing. So we tend to use things like a healing word if somebody is incapacitated and dying. If you can take somebody who's making death saves and then recover hit points to them, that's better than just stabilizing them. But to my understanding, not everybody's play experience is the same. There's certainly campaigns out there where you're going to find that you're going to be using the medicine skill and healing kits over and over again just to stabilize characters. If you're playing in one of those campaigns, then Spare the Dying suddenly becomes an amazing option because suddenly those healing kits don't matter anymore. The medicine skill doesn't matter anymore. One action, you stabilize any creature. So that in those campaigns is going to be really, really useful to you. This is only available from the cleric spell list, so if you need this spell because that's the style of play you tend to find yourself in, then you probably want to choose cleric specifically for this cantrip. For me, I'm probably not going to take Spare the Dying even if I'm playing a cleric. So let's talk about first level spells now. One thing to remember is although you technically know the spell that you select here, if you are playing a caster and you have additional first level slots, you can't use it for this. The wording is specific that you can cast this spell once per day. So you want to select a spell that's maybe useful to be casting once per day. And just like with cantrips, we want to avoid spells that are going to rely on that primary ability score. So that limits our list pretty significantly. The first spell I want to talk about is Bless. Bless is just a straight out good buff. As a first level buff, it's really just one of the best. You're going to select 3 target creatures, maybe including yourself, and those targets are going to get a plus d4 to all attack rolls and to saving throws. Remember that this requires your concentration, and if you are one of the creatures you select, that plus d4 you're giving is also going to add to concentration saves to maintain this spell. So that's a pretty good option for you. That d4 makes a difference. A lot of misses are turned into hits just by adding that 1d4. You get a 1 minute duration, which means it's probably going to last for an entire combat, unless that combat's a real marathon. It's only available from the cleric spell list, but I kind of like this spell if I'm playing any kind of character that's not concentrating on anything else. Now, it does require my action to cast it, so I'm going to tend to look for situations where maybe I can prepare for combat beforehand to cast a spell. Otherwise, I'm giving up probably something pretty valuable in order to be able to cast this spell in the first place. Very useful spell specifically for non-casters or characters that are not concentrating on anything else. The next spell I want to talk about is Featherfall. Featherfall is a spell I'm not going to be taking with just any character. I'm specifically looking for Featherfall if I'm taking this spell. There are certain campaigns where you play where maybe the party gets access to a bunch of griffins and they're flying around on griffins, or maybe they get access to a flying ship, so they're flying around on this flying ship. And if those characters fall, they're often falling to their death because there's going to be potentially a lot of distance between the area you fall from and the ground. That's when you want Featherfall. Featherfall is useful for up to 5 creatures at once, which means that your entire party can fall and you can probably save them all. So if I am playing in one of those campaigns and nobody has access to the Featherfall spell, then I'm probably looking at this feat specifically for that spell. If I'm playing any other kind of campaign where maybe my feet are on the ground most of the time, I'm not going to be taking the Featherfall spell with this feat. This is available from the Bard, Sorcerer, or Wizard list. And again, I'm just taking this spell if I'm playing in a flying campaign. That brings us to the Find Familiar spell. And you guys know, I love this spell. I think it's the best first level spell in the game. And if I'm taking the Magic Initiate feat, I'm often taking it specifically to get this spell. Now, I've talked about how you can use Find Familiar to do the help action, and that help action can give you advantage on an attack in a round, or an ally advantage on an attack in a round. And some of you have mentioned that your DMs won't necessarily go for that, and that's okay. I mean, by Raw, it is allowed. Jeremy Crawford has made tweets on this specifying that it is definitely allowed. But I have to be honest, I don't use it for the help action a lot, because I find if I was going to use it a lot, I don't know, I feel kind of dirty about that. So I use it for a help action once in a while. Generally speaking, maybe combats that are very difficult and we just need something to maybe help turn the tide, or those kinds of situations, then I might use my Find Familiar for the help action. I honestly don't use it all the time, but by Raw you are allowed to. But even if you never use it for that reason, Find Familiar is still a great spell. It can be used so well for scouting, for carrying messages. Generally speaking, the flying familiars are the best because, especially for things like scouting, you can send them up high and then look through their eyes and get that bird's eye view, literally. So flying generally better than non-flying. But then again, non-flying familiars can often be more inconspicuous. Is anyone going to notice that rat walking down the alley? Probably not. It's probably just going to be a bunch of rats and there's one more. So there's certain situations where non-flying familiars are pretty good too. But they're always good. I love Find Familiar. If I don't have Find Familiar already and I take the Magic Initiate feat, it's the first thing I'm thinking of. Only available from the Wizard spell list, and that's why the Wizard spell list is probably the best choice for Magic Initiate. The next spell I'm going to talk about is Goodberry. Goodberry is a good spell. If you are playing and you get access to the Goodberry spell, that's 10 little tiny 1 hit point healing potions. And unlike Healing Word or Cure Wounds, this does not require on your spellcasting ability score at all. You're getting 10 hit points, and that's more hit points than you're going to recover with either of those other spells. So this is the best healing spell, and it doesn't require your spellcasting ability score, which makes it the perfect choice for Magic Initiate. And because it's a pool, you can split it up. You could give 1 hit point to 10 different people if you want. So Goodberry just is lovely for all those reasons. But in addition, it is also useful to feed a character for a day. So if you're playing in a campaign For example, maybe you're wandering through the jungles of Chult, maybe that reminds you of a certain campaign, and you are tracking your encumbrance, and rations take a lot of pounds, especially if you're talking about rations over a long period of time. But if you have access and you can cast Goodberry every day, suddenly you don't need those rations anymore. You can use Goodberry every day to feed everyone in your party and still have more Goodberries left over. They're good for 24 hours. So you still have Goodberries left over for healing when you need it. So this is just a lovely spell, only available from the Druid spell list. And I particularly find it useful in campaigns where we maybe don't have a lot of different kind of healing options. That brings us to the Hex spell, and the Hex spell is pretty unique on this list because Hunter's Mark is the kind of spell that I might look at if it was available, but it's not available on this list because none of the classes that can get Hunter's Mark are available on Magic Initiate. But Hex is, and it's a reasonable substitute. Hex is good for 1 hour duration, adds 1d6 damage to all your attacks. So if you're playing a character that's making lots of attack rolls, that can end up being a lot of damage. And with a 1 hour duration, you can very potentially do this for several different combats. It uses a bonus action to cast, uses a bonus action to change targets, and you also pick an ability score that's going to have disadvantage on ability checks. That means it's useful if you're playing a grappler and you want to maybe have foes that are going to have disadvantage on their resistance to your grapples, or you want to use it on a grappler to give them disadvantage on their grapple checks. In both those situations, Hex is very useful too, and there's no save on that. Now this uses your concentration, so this is best for characters that aren't concentrating on anything else. I love this for fighters who get so many attacks and then they can action surge to get so many more attacks, and then a Hex will add damage to every single one of those attacks, and they're not concentrating on anything else. But I find this is good for any kind of character that's either a grappler or not concentrating on anything else and is making multiple attack rolls in a round. Not as useful for characters that maybe are relying on one big attack like a rogue. This is only gained from the Warlock list, and that's one of the reasons why the Warlock list becomes a reasonable option for the Magic Initiate feat. Finally, there's Shield of Faith. Shield of Faith only available from the Cleric list. It's good for 10 minutes, gives you a +2 to AC, and it's a bonus action cast. Now, +2 bonus to AC isn't a huge bonus, but it's significant. And if I'm playing a melee character, +2 to AC means a lot of hits are going to turn into misses. So if I'm playing a melee character, Shield of Faith is a pretty good option, particularly if I'm not concentrating on anything else. With a 10-minute duration, it easily will last one combat and potentially several combats. Only available from the Cleric spell list, and if I'm playing a melee character who is expecting to be not concentrating on anything else, that's when this spell becomes really good. So you take the Magic Initiate feat. Which class do you want to select? So I'm just going to be honest with you guys. I've seen some other feat videos where they represent all the different class options you can choose with Magic Initiate as if they're somehow equal. They're not equal. Okay, some are just better than others. So let's talk about which ones are the best and the worst. Well, because we're looking at spells that don't necessarily rely on your primary spell casting ability score, then suddenly it doesn't really matter which class we choose. It matters what spells we receive. And there's certain classes that are going to just have better choices than other classes. The one I think is the worst is probably the Bard list. I like Bards, and I like the Bard spell list, but if you don't have a good charisma, suddenly the Bard spell list doesn't look so good. There's just not a lot of choices here. I mean, for cantrips, there's some decent options. There's Minor Illusion, which is a good option. There's Light, which is a good option. So we have some good cantrip options, but when we come to first level spells, there's not much here. I could see maybe taking something like a Healing Word, but again, Healing Word is going to rely on your charisma. So we won't expect the same kind of healing that we would expect if we were playing a character that had a great charisma score. Still might be okay in certain situations. And I understand sometimes a DM will give Magic Initiate maybe as a bonus, and maybe you don't choose which class you select. So that you get Magic Initiate Bard, so you're going to just take those kind of spells. So what would I take? I'd take Minor Illusion, I'd probably take Light, and I would probably take something like Featherfall. The second worst one is Sorcerer. Now, I like a Sorcerer spell list. I think it's a good spell list. It's maybe the second best in the game. but it's second best in the game to the wizard. And the reason it's second best in the game to the wizard is the sorcerer spell list is basically the wizard spell list, but smaller. And a lot of good spells are taken off of the wizard list to create the sorcerer list. That means the sorcerer is just kind of a worse option than wizard, especially when we don't really care about our ability score. And Find Familiar is one of those spells that sorcerers don't get. And it's the reason I'm going to take Magic Initiate in a lot of cases. So Sorcerer just becomes kind of the poor cousin to Wizard. There are some good cantrips I'd take. Again, I'd look at Minor Illusion, Mage Hand, Mending, those kind of spells. But again, when we get to first level spells, the options are kind of limited. We don't necessarily have a great charisma, so that really limits our options. Again, spells like Featherfall are available on this list, but in general, not a lot of good choices for your first level spell. That brings us to Cleric. Now, there's some reasons why I might choose Cleric as my Magic Initiate, because there are some first level spells that are only available from the Cleric list that are good spells. When it comes to cantrips, I'm going to take Guidance for sure. And then there's a few other options for my other choice. I might choose Light, I might choose Mending, I might choose Spare the Dying, simply because Cleric is the only list for which I can get that cantrip, even though that's not a cantrip I tend to select myself that much. And then for first level spells, there's really two great options. The first is Bless, and the second is Shield of Faith. So I've kind of talked about why you might want to take either of those spells, but those are the reasons why we would look at Cleric as our option for Magic Initiate. That brings us to Druid. I think Druid is a good choice, and I have taken Magic Initiate Druid with Wizards on occasion simply because I love the options that Druid gives that maybe a Wizard spell list doesn't have. When I'm looking at cantrips, mainly it's Guidance, right? Again, I would look at things like Mending as a secondary option, but I'm going to take Guidance for sure with Druid. And then as a first level spell, I'm going to take Goodberry. Goodberry is a great spell, doesn't rely on my wisdom at all, so it's perfect for selection from this feat. And finally, the best choice, obviously, is Wizard. With Wizard, with my cantrips, I have lots of choices. I'm probably looking at Minor Illusion and then maybe something like a Mage Hand. And then for my first level spell, I'm definitely taking Find Familiar for all the reasons I've mentioned on numerous videos. So that's my deep dive into Magic Initiate. Hope you enjoyed it. And for those two viewers that asked for this, this was for you. So I hope you enjoyed it and it's useful to you. But for everybody, that's it. I'm just going to sit back and relax and have some fun because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.